There we go. So the first question I had, again, if any other questions come up throughout this, just feel free to chime in and ask. The first couple questions I had have to do with Unit 1, and they are to describe the difference between a change in supply and a change in quantity supplied. So let me share the whiteboard and kind of give you a walkthrough of that. So the first thing is that we have our supply and demand curves. So we have quantity on our x-axis, we have P or price on our y-axis, downward sloping demand curve, upward sloping supply curve. So we'll start with just the demand curve by itself first. The first thing that you want to figure out is what is the difference between a change in demand and a change in quantity demand. So let's say we're at this point right here. Okay, so you have a given quantity of a certain amount. We go down to here, you have Q1, we'll call it Q1, and you have a corresponding price, P1, okay? So if you're at that point right there, we'll call it point A, and the price increases or decreases. So let's say that the price decreases. If the price decreases and we end up here at point B, okay, so we're now at point B, we now have a new price because the price decreased. And we have an increase in our quantity demanded because our quantity demanded increased. So now we're at Q2. Now, the only thing that changed in this scenario was that the price of the good or service changed. The final market price of it changed. So if the market price changes and quantity demanded is increasing, that is a change in quantity demanded. We're moving along the same demand curve to a new point. So this is an example of a change in quantity demanded. Now, if we want to describe a change in demand, that's going to be some variable that isn't the price of the product. That could be income, that could be taste and preferences, that could be expected future price, that could be price of substitute or complement. Whatever it may be, it's not the actual price on this graph. And so the consequence of something like income changing is that we're going to shift the demand curve in another direction. So let's say that we're now here at D2. Okay, whoops, D2. So that shift to the right of the demand curve is a change in demand. Our fundamental assumptions have changed, and thus we have to use a completely new demand curve to analyze the relationship between price and quantity. So a movement from A to B would be a change in quantity demanded. We're only changing the actual amount we want because the price has changed. Whereas a change in demand itself is going to be, say, a movement from A to C or B to C. It's a change and a shift in the entire curve due to one of the assumptions that isn't price changing. So that is how we describe the difference between a change in quantity demanded and a change in demand. The same logic is going to apply for supply. So if we start over again here, and I describe and draw a supply curve instead. Okay, so we have a supply curve. So we now have quantity here. We have price here. Downward sloping. Oops, we don't need that. We need upward sloping supply curve. So we're now here at S. So if we were, say, at point A, then you would have a corresponding quantity supply at Q1. You would have a corresponding price at P1. Now, if you increase the market price of the good or service, you move up along the given, the given supply curve to point B. So now you have a higher quantity supplied at Q2 due to that increase in the price from P1 to P2. So a change in quantity supplied, again, is just a change in the amount that is going to be supplied due to a change in the market price of the good or service. So we're just moving along a given supply curve. If one of those fundamental things changes, like technology or costs or alternatives in production or number of firms or something like that changes, then that's going to be a fundamental change in the supply curve, and we're going to shift the supply curve either to the right or to the left. So if there's an increase in the number of firms, we would shift the supply curve to the right, and we would move from S to S2, and you'd have a new fundamental assumption. So you'd have a new output, say at point C. So you now have a change in supply because the actual supply curve changes. So when we're saying change in supply, we're changing the entire curve. When we're saying change in quantity, we're just moving along a given supply curve. And the same is true for demand, as we just described. So that is the difference between supply changing and quantity supply changing. Now, the next question I had to do with calculating opportunity costs. So again, this exam is cumulative. So that means things that we talked about in day one, week one, exam one, homework one, that's all potentially on the final exam. So it's not just going to be unit 3 material. It's mostly going to be unit 3 material. Let's say like 70% of it's going to be unit 3 material. But there still might be questions from the previous exams or questions in similar in scope to the previous exams that you would have to analyze to get to the right answer. So if we have a production possibilities frontier, that's going to look like this. You're going to have a good over here. So we'll say smoothies and sandwiches are our two things we can make. We're going to have a production possibilities frontier that is going to connect between the two axes. So let's say that if we only make sandwiches, we can make 250 sandwiches. If we only make smoothies, we can make 750 smoothies. Okay. So if we want to calculate opportunity cost, we're saying what is the amount of one thing we're going to have to give up to be able to make something else. So if I'm only making sandwiches, I can make 250 sandwiches. If I'm only making smoothies, I can make 750 smoothies. But in order for me to figure out how many sandwiches I have to give up to make a smoothie, or how many sandwiches, or excuse me, smoothies I have to give up to make sandwiches, I'm going to have to calculate the opportunity cost, which is just going to be the slope or the inverse of the slope or reciprocal of the slope for the goods, respectively. Why do we know this? We know this because there's only two things on here. Now, in reality, you're deciding between 50 things you might make, 10 things you might make. The reality is that because of our two-dimensional graph, you only have two options. So you know it's opportunity cost because opportunity cost is the highest valued alternative that must be given up in order to engage in activity. So giving up that activity is going to be the highest valued thing, is going to be the other thing, because there's only one option, one substitute. So since we only have the intercepts and we have a linear production possibilities frontier, we know that the slope is constant. So we don't have to worry so much about like calculus or anything like that. We can just take the slope of this. So if we want to find the opportunity cost of making one more smoothie, let's start from here at this intercept and end up at this intercept. So we're going to start with 250 sandwiches and no smoothies. So if we go down to the bottom here to the origin, we're giving up 250. smoothies. And if we go over to this intercept, we're gaining 750 smoothies. It's gonna be, so we're giving up 250 sandwiches, we're gaining 700 smoothies. So when we plug this in, we give up 250 sandwiches, we gain 750 smoothies. So if we break this down, 250 over 750 basically breaks down to 1/3. So the actual interpretation of this is, in order to give up, or excuse me, to gain 3 smoothies, you must give up 1 sandwich. Now, it might be easier for us to interpret it, especially if we're going to be using this for comparative advantage, to make the denominator 1. So if we want to gain 1 smoothie, we just divide both sides by 3, so you give up 1/3 of the sandwich. So you're giving up 1 sandwich to make 3 smoothies, or 1/3 of a sandwich to make 1 smoothie. So that's how you calculate the opportunity cost. If you want to find the opportunity cost of making a sandwich, you just flip it upside down. So you would give up 750 smoothies, and you would gain 250 sandwiches. So when you do this calculation, you get 3 here, you get 1 here. So the interpretation is going to be, in order to gain 1 sandwich, you must give up 3 smoothies. So that's your interpretation right there. In order to gain 1 sandwich, you have to give up 3 smoothies. So that's it. It's just the slope. So even if you have a bunch of grid lines with a bunch of markings in between, the only one you really need is the extremes, the 2 intercepts, because you have a constant slope because it's linear. So if you were to do comparative advantage, you would be comparing these opportunity costs with the respective opportunity costs of the same goods for a different person, figure out who's giving up less to make that product. That would determine that you have a comparative advantage for that good or service. And then as a result, you would specialize in the thing that each party has a respective comparative advantage in, and then trade a certain amount that's negotiated to end up mutually at a point that is beyond your initial production possibilities for the tier 100. And that's the basis for trade. So any questions so far? Any follow-up? Any other questions that you're interested in me addressing? I have some more. I just wanted to make sure that I addressed those concerns if you have any. Okay, so some of the following questions that I've seen have to do with unemployment and CPI. So the first question I have has to do with, let's see here, frictional unemployment. So if you are going through the second exam, I think this is question 12, 15, something like that. I can't remember. But there are 3 types of unemployment that we have. There's frictional unemployment, there's structural unemployment, and there is cyclical unemployment. So cyclical unemployment is unemployment that arises from business cycle recession. So if we enter into a recession, typically what ends up happening is workers get laid off because there's less consumption in the economy, and businesses feel that because they're selling less, So to cut costs as quickly as possible, they usually lay off workers because they don't need as much production, and the labor is usually the most expensive piece, so they lay workers off. So typically during recessions, you see an uptick in unemployment. We might see an uptick in unemployment in the wake of layoffs at the federal level. I think I did a calculation last night that if 100,000 federal employees are laid off, which is the projection that's coming up in the next month through all of the agencies and all the probationary workers that have been laid off, that would probably increase unemployment by 0.1% in the entire economy, just those workers. And so if you add in maybe cutting back on consumption spending because people are worried about losing their jobs or the economy, and that slows things down faster, and then you end up in this vicious cycle, and then you end up with potentially like 5%, 6% unemployment by the end of the year. So we'll see what happens. And anyways, that's what cyclical unemployment is. If we don't have any cyclical unemployment, we're assumed to be at the natural rate of unemployment or full employment. There's like a bunch of names for it. There's the non-accelerating inflation rate of unemployment. There's the non-cyclical unemployment rate of unemployment. There's full employment. There's natural rate of unemployment. They're all the same thing, basically. And so if we have an absence of cyclical unemployment, then we're said to be at full employment, which is just the sum of our structural unemployment and our frictional unemployment. Frictional unemployment is those who are entering the workforce or who are unemployed but are kind of in the job market process. They've got options lined up, they've got interviews, they've got potential things that match up with the skill sets that they have. And so you're going to count as unemployed while you're searching for a job, but the assumption is that inevitably you'll find something. Structural unemployment, on the other hand, is that a lot of the jobs that are available don't really match up with your skill set. And as a consequence, you have to basically either settle for being underemployed or you just don't find anything. And it's 6, 12 months later and you're still struggling to find work. Whatever the circumstance, those are considered natural rates of unemployment. So there was a question on the exam that talked about saying, oh, keep searching, there's jobs that you qualify for. That counts as frictional unemployment because if you didn't have a job that was available for you that you didn't qualify or that you did qualify for, that would be structural unemployment. If it was cyclical unemployment, it'd probably be laid off due to economic circumstances. And it's difficult to find work for anybody during those times because everyone's kind of not hiring. They're more focusing on cutting back versus adding on, unless you're in a growth field. So typically education is counter-cyclical, where people tend to come back to school and try to re-educate and get new skills for whatever growth field exists at the time of recession to try and offset things if they've been laid off or if they've been furloughed or something like that in the wake of that recession. So frictional unemployment would be what it is, because frictional unemployment is just anybody that kind of has jobs that they qualify for, but there's this transition time between entering the labor force and actually becoming employed. So if you haven't gotten a job yet, but there's still jobs you're interviewing for that you qualify for, etc., that would be considered frictional. If you don't have any jobs that really match up with you, then you're considered structural. And that goes back to the question about if there's no cyclical unemployment, we would be considered to be at full employment or the natural rate of unemployment. So it might come up with a different term on the exam or on the homework than what they're using because they've changed the name of it like 5 times in the past 10 years. So when I was taking macro in undergrad, it was NAIRU, not accelerating inflation rate of unemployment. Natural rate of unemployment or full employment is kind of the standard rate that we talk about in textbooks and literature. But the Federal Reserve is currently using, I think, the NCROU, which is the non-cyclical rate of unemployment rate. Another question I had to do with the biases of CPI. So let me share the whiteboard again. So the biases of CPI have to do with the fact that CPI can sometimes overstate the true level of inflation due to economic concerns. Now, one of the reasons why inflation can be slightly over exaggerated by CPI is because of this. So when we learned about demand, we learned about this downward sloping demand curve, which means that as prices go up, your consumption or your quantity demanded for that product goes down because you're presumably consuming less because you have less budget available to allocate to that if it becomes more and more expensive. So at the margins, you start substituting away for something else or just stop buying because you can't afford as much as you used to. The CPI uses a fixed market basket of goods and services. So that means that whether it was 1976 or 2026 or 2016 or 2006 or 1986, it's going to assume that the average amount of stuff that you consumed in that month was the same. So if egg prices go up from $2 a dozen to $7 a dozen, I don't know how many eggs you buy. I don't really buy eggs that frequently. I'm not Rocky. I'm not a baker. If I want an egg, I'll probably just go to like a breakfast place and get some eggs and toast or whatever. Not really using eggs at home personally, so this hasn't impacted me. Certainly not enough to influence my vote in an election, but but still, it can still have a significant impact if you're consuming them consistently. And like if I want to bake something that uses an egg and I go to the egg section of wherever I'm shopping at, whether it's Meijer, Aldi, etc., and I get there and I see that they've gone up from $2 to $5, I'm like, what the heck? So I totally get that logic, but the reality is that unless you're just buying one dozen consistently over time, you probably aren't going to change your habits. But if you're like a family that buys like 4 dozen eggs and you're not raising chickens in the backyard and hens that are laying eggs for you, there's going to probably be a significant group of those people that go from buying 4 dozen to 3 dozen, or 3 dozen to 1 dozen, or 2 dozen to none. And at those margins, you're going to have a reduction in the demand based on this upward sloping demand curve. But that's not how CPI works. CPI holds quantity constant because of the ceteris paribus assumption. In order for you to be able to understand how price influences, or excuse me, prices have fluctuated over time, you have to keep the quantity fixed. Just like with real GDP, you have to keep the price fixed and the quantity varying, because if you change them both, you can't reasonably conclude that the change in output was due to productivity increases in growth. It was just due to inflation. Likewise is true for CPI. We can't vary the quantity when prices go up because of the fact that we're going to be violating the ceteris paribus assumption. So we have to hold quantity constant and see how much prices are changing relative to that market basket we say that families are consistently consuming month to month. So if you use that logic, then our demand curve would look like this. It would be vertical, because it doesn't matter if eggs were $2 a dozen, $5 a dozen, $7 a dozen, $20 a dozen. It doesn't matter. The assumption is that the average family of four in an urban area would consume the same amount of eggs, whether they're $20 a dozen or $2 a dozen. It doesn't matter. And so that's why it can potentially overstate inflation, because it's not adjusting to how we as human beings would adjust. If you go to the grocery store and everything that you typically bought went up by like 8%, you probably wouldn't buy everything the same and say, oh, my bill is 8% higher. Chances are you're probably going to be like, okay, well, that thing's on sale, that thing's not. I'm going to buy the thing that's on sale. And you're going to manipulate your consumption habits so your budget is consistent. Maybe you're still getting less than you normally would, but you're doing your best to try and get as much as you can because that's how you operate. And that's how we normally operate. I mean, even if there wasn't inflation in the economy, there's implicit inflation when you go to a specific grocery store consistently because they have different sales. So they're raising prices, lowering prices consistently on you, which means that you're not going to probably buy the exact same amount every single week because you're like, okay, well, Oreos were on sale last week. They're not this week. So unless you like have a super inelastic demand for that stuff, you're probably not going to buy them again. Maybe you still have some left over, but you're probably not going to buy them again because you're going to substitute with something that's a cheaper snack relative. So that's all that is. CPI potentially has an upward bias and overstating how much it contributes because of this assumed vertical demand curve. It can understate inflation due to the way it's weighted potentially. So if there's something that's like inelastic and it's like, let's say gas, right? So if you don't have like an electric car and gas prices, let's say they went up to like $9 a gallon tomorrow and you needed to fill up your tank of gas. Let's say you have a 10-gallon tank or a 15-gallon tank. You normally would have spent, let's say, $3 a gallon. That's kind of how it's hovered over the last year or so. So normally that would cost you $30 to $45 to fill up. If gas all of a sudden tomorrow became $9 a gallon, you would now be spending 90 to, oh, I don't know, 90 to $135 every time you filled up. If that became the case, it wouldn't be that you would get less gas. I mean, maybe you would, but because it's so much more expensive and it's taking up so much more of your budget, there's a potential understatement of inflation because of the fact that the way they're weighting it in the CPI calculation might actually be underselling how much of your budget it's taking up. So right now they have weights that basically say, okay, this takes up 40%. So housing is like 40% of your CPI is based on that. So if housing prices go up significantly, then you're going to see an even bigger impact on CPI, an upward swing of it. But if gas is only like, let's say, 10% of the CPI calculation, but all of a sudden, because it's tripled in price, becomes 30% or 25% of your budget, it could be understating it because of the fact that it's not taking up the proper proportion of your budget. So that's a potential understatement. But typically they're changing it frequently enough, and stuff like that doesn't happen frequently enough where it's as big of a deal. So yeah, but to answer your question, yes, it's possible. We didn't really address it. We kind of addressed the other way of overstating versus understating, but it is possible for something like that to understate inflation. So if they're also omitting something, which typically they're not omitting, like some people say that there are types of inflation measurements that don't include food and gas, which people are like, well, I spend so much money on food and gas. Why wouldn't you include that? Are you trying to like hide something? Well, they're not. There's just different measurements of it. But otherwise, that's basically the answer to you. Let's see here. I think I had another question in my email. Does anyone have any other questions or homework questions or test questions that you wanted me to address that you didn't get right or you didn't understand that you would like help with? Okay, so this other question I have has to do with the value of the dollar impacting aggregate supply and aggregate demand. So let me share the whiteboard again. So remember, for our aggregate demand, aggregate supply model, GDP or Y, real GDP, or Y is our horizontal axis or x-axis, and then price level, which could be CPI or something like that, is our vertical or y-axis measurement. So we'll have a downward sloping aggregate demand curve. So remember, this is including all goods and services demanded in the domestic US economy. If we're looking at this from perspective of the US, we would have an upward sloping short run aggregate supply curve that basically is the Keynesian theoretical model, short run aggregate supply. There's frictions in the economy, sticky prices, sticky wages, etc., that prevent us from getting to our equilibrium at all times. Now we're going to be at an equilibrium, but like we're not at our long run equilibrium. Our long run equilibrium is going to be indicated by the long run aggregate supply curve, or LRAS. So LRAS is our benchmark that tells us where we should presumably be. So that's denoted with Y sub P, which is our potential real GDP. And then this intersection of short run aggregate supply and aggregate demand is going to be our actual level of output in the economy. So this is how much prices are. So PL star is going to tell us how much the prices are in the economy relative to the base year. So how much inflation do we have year to year, or compared to the base year? And then if we go down to the GDP axis, or x-axis, we will have our actual output level, so Y star. So in this example, we would have an output gap. So if you were trying to curtail this output gap, you would probably engage in something like expansionary monetary or expansionary fiscal policy. Expansionary monetary policy would be buying securities, trying to increase the money supply, which would lower interest rates, and then lowering interest rates makes it cheaper to borrow money. And as a result, you would increase the amount of aggregate demand. But that's not what was asked in the question. The question was, what would be the impact in this model if there was a change in the value of the dollar? So when we say the value of the dollar, we're talking about exchange rates. So value of the dollar has nothing to do with prices domestically. It has everything to do with how much purchasing power you have with US dollars in a foreign currency. So if you were to go on a trip to Europe or something like that, or even Canada or Mexico, Mexico has a different currency than the United States. Canada has a different currency than the United States. Europe has a different currency than the United States. And so when you buy stuff in those countries, or even you import something from those countries, there's a two-step process. The first process is that you have to take your dollars, convert them to the currency in which you're buying the product from, and then pay the price in that currency. So, for instance, let's say you go to Europe and you see something that is 10 euros, okay? Now, if you're in Europe, you can buy something. You can either go to a money exchange place and exchange US dollars in cash for euros, or you can go to an ATM and withdraw euros from an ATM like you would withdraw dollars. It's just that you would get euros instead of dollars, or even if you're in Canada, you get Canadian dollars instead of US dollars. If you're in Mexico, you get pesos instead of dollars, etc. Well, if you were to go to Europe, so the Euro countries are France, Germany, Spain, Italy, Finland, all the Baltic countries like Estonia, Lithuania, Latvia. I believe there's a couple of countries that are in the EU that don't use euros, like the Czech Republic and Hungary. But there are other countries that are also not in the EU that use euros as well, and then et cetera, et cetera. But anyways, regardless of all that lesson, let's say you want to buy something that's 10 euros. Okay. Well, the thing is that a dollar and a euro are not the same. They have what's called a floating exchange rate based on money supply. So I believe last I checked a couple of days ago before we were talking about it in class, I'll just look it up right now. Let's see here. A euro is $1.05. So it's actually gone up a little bit. So as of like last week, it was about $1.03 to $1.04 per euro. Now it's about $1.05 per euro. So what does that mean? That means if you wanted to buy something in euros that was 10 euros, it would actually be 10 euros times $1.05 because that's how much it costs for 1 euro. So you'd have to do 10 times 1.05. And that actually means that if you wanted this in dollars, it would actually be $10.50. Okay. So step one was either you have to exchange dollars for euros. So if you wanted to buy 10 euros from the bank or withdraw from the ATM and your bank account is in US dollars, what will happen is you'll withdraw 10 euros from the ATM and they'll go in the exchange rate to your bank and say, okay, it's $1.05 per euro. So they're going to charge your bank 10.50. So what that means is if the euro is getting stronger. So remember I said it was $1.03 per euro about a week ago. Now it's about $1.05. What that means is that if you were to buy something that was $10 as a foreigner, that would be cheaper than 10 euros. It also means that if you were to like say vacation somewhere in Europe, it would be more expensive to buy things in Europe because now it's an extra 2 cents for every euro you spent than it was before. So basically a 2% increase in the cost because of the exchange rate. So in this example, in the last week of it going from about $1.03 per euro to $1.05 per euro, that actually means that the value of the dollar is diminishing, means it's weaker. Now that has no bearing on consumption domestically. Because if you are paying prices in US dollars, there's no middleman process of changing currency. If prices go up, that's inflation. If prices don't go up and the exchange rate goes down or up relative to foreign currencies, it has no bearing on you because you're not buying things from other countries. You're only buying things in America. So, what that means though is that it will affect international trade because if you want to buy something from another country, you have to convert it to that currency, then buy it. So that means if the value of the dollar is diminishing, it's going to be more expensive for us to buy things from other countries. If you're buying something from another country, you want to buy American goods from another country and the value of the dollar is diminishing. That means that relative to say if you're from Germany or something like that and you want to buy something from America, you just got a 2% discount because when you go to convert your euros to dollars, they're going to be worth more than they were last week. And so that means that good or service that you might have bought is now 2% cheaper if you were to buy it from the United States, notwithstanding tariffs and shipping costs and all that stuff. But if the value of the dollar decreases, that means that there's upward pressure on exports because now it's going to be cheaper for people with other currencies to buy them. It's going to be more expensive for us to import stuff from those countries, so we're going to be less inclined to do that. So if the positive value is getting bigger and the negative value is getting smaller, then the net change is that there's going to be an increase in net exports. And if there's an increase in net exports, we visualize that by shifting the aggregate demand curve to the right. And this is if the value of the dollar decreases, not increases. If it increased, it would be the opposite. Foreign goods would be cheaper, domestic goods would be more expensive, and as a result, you would want to buy them from somewhere else. Because again, the average human being is focused on cost, not nationalism or patriotism or protectionism or whatever. So Walmart, an American company, people shop there because it's cheaper. And most of their stuff comes from China. So even though they're owned by an American company, they're in Bentonville, Arkansas. Most of their profit margins are generated because they aren't using American labor to make their goods and services. The only labor that they're hiring is the workers in their stores. All the stuff that they're selling is not American. Most of it isn't. And that's because humans who have limited budgets are trying to stretch their budget as far as possible. So, if you're one of those people that is all about protecting and building, making things domestically, you have to be vigilant and actually figure out where is it made and how much are you going to pay for it. Because a lot of people say they want that stuff, and then it turns out that they'll just get the cheap thing anyway, because it's better for their budget. So people say, "Oh, I want this thing that's made locally," but if it costs 30% more, they're like, "Well, why would I pay 30% more for something?" Oh, well, it's because you want to keep it in the community. But then when push comes to shove, most people don't actually stand by those principles. They just buy the cheap stuff. And they'll say things on social media like they believe in it, but it's not really true. It's not. It's what your actions do that matter, not what you say. Uh, So that's how the value of the dollar impacts aggregate demand within the context of this. And then just for completion's sake, to give you an overview of um, policy, so that way you feel good to go with that. Normally, there's like a extra project that you'll work on in this class, but because we had one last week, I made you not responsible for that assignment. So I want to make sure that because you didn't get that extra practice, that you kind of see what's going on in practice, so you're ready for the exam. So we have price levels, we have real GDP, we have our upward sloping short run aggregate supply curve, and we have our long run aggregate supply curve. So if you look at this long run aggregate supply curve, our potential GDP is here. Our actual level of output is here. So here's our actual price. We go down to the GDP axis. This is our actual level of output. Now, Y star is higher than YP, so we actually have, in this case, an inflationary. Which seems great that we're actually overshooting our potential GDP, but if we don't have any labor productivity increases that would cause long run aggregate supply curve to sustainably hit that point, we're going to run into a problem at some point. The problem is this. Step one, if you see that the economy is doing really well like this, you might think, hey, let's just ramp up production because good times are rolling. The problem with that is if you try to ramp up production at this point, there's not enough workers available because YP represents your natural rate of unemployment. So there's a shortage of workers in the market, shortage of workers in the economy. So you run the risk of starting a new plant, new factory, hiring new workers, new facility, You don't have any workers that are available to be hired. There's not enough applicants for the jobs. There's not enough qualified people because there's only so few people in the labor force. And yeah, maybe there's one that's qualified and then there's another one. But if you need to hire 100 people fast, that's not really going to cut it. So the quickest solution to that is that you poach workers from somewhere else. You say, okay, hey, this factory is paying 21 an hour. We'll pay you 28 an hour to leave your work. Because if we pay you 21.01 or 22, you're probably going to say, well, it's not worth the drama and the stress of changing insurance and changing all this other stuff unless like you really hate your previous job. So you got to pay them. If you're paying them 28 versus 21, that's 33% increase in the labor cost to that new company to poach them away. And that's going to put upward pressure on wages, which is going to put upward pressure on costs. When you have upward pressure on costs, that's going to affect short run aggregate supply. And short run aggregate supply is going to shift to the left to the point where basically you end up at that long run macroeconomic equilibrium. But that's actually indicating a loss in output. So you lost that output, higher prices, less output. This is what we call stagflation. We don't like that. Stagflation is not good. Stagflation means the economy is stagnating and prices are going up. So that's the risk that happens if we don't engage in a policy. If we engage in a policy, we need to engage in a contractionary policy, because what we want to do is we want to basically induce the aggregate demand curve to shift to the left and end up at that same output level that we'd end up if we did nothing. But instead of being at PL2 star, we would rather be at PL3 star, which is going to be lower than even the original P star. So this shift to the left from 81 to 82, that is going to be contractionary policy. Now, you could argue reducing government spending, raising taxes is viable solutions for contractionary policy, but if you're a politician that's trying to get reelected or to keep your constituents happy, it's not really a policy that is attractive as viable. So we've leaned heavily on monetary policy for this. So contractionary monetary policy is going to be selling securities, which reduces the money supply, which is going to increase interest rates, which is going to disincentivize borrowing, which is going to reduce C&I, which reduces AD. So that's your steps. It's indirect. The Fed has to go and vacuum up basically money that's out in the economy by selling them bonds that they'll sit on and wait on instead of circulating that money. That'll reduce the money supply. You reduce the money supply, that increases interest rates. So if we go back to that graph that we had last week, I'll show you that. So we had a graph that indicated the money supply. So we have a vertical line that indicates the money supply curve. So this is MS, which is your money supply. You have money demand, which is downward sloping. Remember, money demand is where the crowding out effect came from, where if the government has to borrow money, then this shifts to the right, which raises interest rates, which keeps people from borrowing money because they're not the government. So this axis is the amount of money that's available, and then the y-axis is your interest rate. So if you're at this equilibrium point, your interest rate is here. at I star if the Federal Reserve engages in contractionary monetary policy. What ends up happening is the money supply actually decreases, shifts to the left. So you now have a new money supply curve at MS2. So if you're now at MS2, you shift to the left, and then you now have a new equilibrium interest rate, which is higher. So you're now at I2 star. If interest rates are higher, then people borrow less. When people borrow less, they consume less and they invest less, which results in a reduction in aggregate demand. So this graph helps explain why aggregate demand would shift to the left from a decrease in money supply and shift to the right from an increase in money supply. So that's how contractionary monetary policy works. Does anybody have any questions? So just as a reminder, the exam is like a 70% new material. So basically anything in unit 3. So anything from homeworks 5, 6, and 7. So it could be aggregate expenditures, aggregate demand, aggregate supply, money, monetary policy, fiscal policy, long run growth. So rule of 70 could come up. Average annual growth rate could come up. So don't forget how to do those calculations. Unit 2 and unit 1 is about 30% combined. So remember how supply and demand works. Remember how to calculate opportunity cost and comparative advantage. Remember how all the definition of GDP, what is included, what isn't included, how to calculate the unemployment rate, how to calculate CPI, inflation rate, all of that is potentially on the exam. So make sure to go through those old exam questions before you take the final. It's possible maybe one of those questions is actually on the final or something similar. So if you troubleshoot, you see the answer, you walk through it, you figure out how to get to the right answer. Chances are, even if the numbers aren't the same, the process is the same. So it will really do you a world of good to go back and go through those previous assignments again. You don't have to necessarily submit them, but just work through them on your own time to make sure that you're understanding those calculations. But again, remember the conceptual stuff as well. The exam is built to be an application-based exam rather than just a kind of a knowledge regurgitation and memorization type test. So again, make sure that you have a good base knowledge of what you're doing before you take the exam. Further, when it comes to the exam, make sure that you're not utilizing AI type of response generations. Make sure that you're utilizing your own work, your own knowledge. Like maybe you use AI to like summarize your notes so that there's like a nice outline that's efficient to study. But if you Google search, you just copy paste in a question from the exam into Google and it might give you an answer. Maybe you use ChatGPT or some other type of generative AI service. Most students that do that are the easiest to detect that they're cheating because they don't know what is right and what isn't. They don't verify that their logic makes sense. They've studied so little, they're so deficient in their knowledge that they just kind of like look at the answer and say, that looks right. The buzzwords pop up, and then you send it in, you submit it. I look at it. It's obvious to me that you pulled this from some nonsense AI because it's nowhere near correct. It wouldn't make sense. If you paid attention in class, it wouldn't make sense. So don't fall into that trap. It's because when I go through and grade things, that's the easiest way to detect it, and it's not good for you because it hurts your grade. It's not good for me because then it's more paperwork when I have to say why you didn't pass, and it's because of this AI stuff or whatever. So make sure that when you walk out of this class that you feel like you've learned something, that you've actually taken some of this to heart, you know how to apply it. Because that's really what this class is about. I mean, maybe it's just a gen ed requirement and you have to take it to get a degree and stuff like that. And I get it. I understand that logic. But at the end of the day, in this world where things are just becoming more and more transactional every day, everything is about money, everything is about a transaction, everything is about checking a box. What Find a purpose for living and acquire skills that make it worthwhile living, acquire skills that make it so that you're a good citizen and a productive member of society. Acquire skills so that when you have to problem solve for yourself, because no one's coming to save you, no one's coming to help you, you know how to figure it out for yourself. Um, Maybe you'll be a single parent someday. Maybe you'll have to caretake for family members someday. Maybe you're going to be running a business someday or running the world. Whatever it is, you're going to need those skills. And right now, it might not seem like those skills are valued, but someday you know what's going to hit the fan worse than it already has. And it's going to take people that are competent to fix the mess. And so be one of the people that is capable of doing that. Um, no matter whether it's understanding how to calculate CPI or just understanding how the world is around you or whatever classes you take or whatever major you have. Uh, just just value yourself enough and value yourself to the point where acquiring these skills and doing the best you can and doing right by yourself is important to you. Because if you just kind of say, oh well, like this little machine will take care of it, this computer will solve everything for me and I don't have to do anything. Well, at some point you're basically making yourself less valuable to the world around you and to yourself. So when real problems happen, how do you solve them? So um, again, you have 4 hours to complete the exam. It's not due till Wednesday night. So if you want to take it today and get it out of the way, great. If you want to wait till Wednesday afternoon, that's fine. If you want to take it during our class period, because we don't have a live class on Wednesday, by all means, use that time to do that. Since you'll have a 2 hour free block, maybe that's the perfect time to take it. If you have any questions between now and then, feel free to email me, contact me, so I can help you and make sure that you're in the best position to succeed. If you don't have any questions, though, um, I wish you the best of luck on the exam. I thank you for your hard work and your engagement and your contributions to the discussion boards throughout this semester and questions that you might have had. I hope you have a safe and enjoyable spring break after this week, and I wish you the best of luck and don't be a stranger. So thank you for your time. If you need anything, let me know. Otherwise, enjoy the rest of your day. Good luck, and I'll talk to you some point. So take care.